By the garbage dump, under the scorching 104-degree sun, a frail, bone-thin woman whispered just one word, Toto. And in that moment, a soldier, a man who had faced death on the battlefield and triumphed over enemies, broke down and cried like a child. That woman was none other than his own sister, the same sister who used to sing him to sleep, who shielded him from beatings when they were just kids. For 17 long years, she had lived without a name, without papers, without anyone remembering she even existed. A soul forgotten by society, not dead, but not really alive either. How can a man protect an entire nation, yet lose the one person who once meant the world to him? And if a future president can unknowingly lose his own sister to poverty, how many others are slowly vanishing in silence across our cities without anyone noticing? Ouagadougou on a March afternoon didn't feel like a capital. There were no towering buildings reflecting light, no rushing crowds, no roaring engines or impatient honking. Instead, the city seemed to sunk under the weight of the sun, its 104-degree heat pressing down on every surface. Asphalt roads were cracked and peeling like old scars, exhaling a smell of melted tar, dust, and the unmistakable stench of burning trash. Smoke curled lazily from small fires by the roadside, where people burned refuse not out of necessity, but habit, a habit born from having no better options. The air was thick, not just from heat, but from the absence of motion. It was as though time had slowed, squeezed thin by the weight of poverty, and the silence between people had grown heavy. Streets twisted and narrowed like veins in a neglected body, lined with crumbling houses made of patchwork cement and rusted tin, their roofs sagging and overlapping like memories left out in the rain. Power lines tangled above like cobwebs that no one had dared to clean, because no one believed light would return. People moved slowly, not because they were tired, but because they had nowhere to be and nothing left to chase. An old woman sat hunched beneath the overhang of a shuttered convenience store, her baskets of goods untouched. Her eyes, sunken and distant, faced the street but saw nothing. She wasn't waiting for customers. She was waiting, perhaps, for time to pass, or for it to end. A boy, shirtless and barefoot, sat with his back against a half-dead tree, gnawing on a dry piece of sugar cane. There was no expression on his face. Not hunger, not boredom, just stillness. The kind that comes from forgetting what it's like to expect something better. These weren't just citizens. They were phantoms of a city that once dreamed and now merely endured. Ouagadougou, in that moment, didn't need to announce its suffering. It lived it, quietly, completely. Into this silence creaked a small beige truck, sun-faded and bruised by years of service. It groaned through the narrow alleys of the city's oldest quarter, where maps blurred and memory guided more than signs. The engine wheezed like a tired old man, dragging his lungs through one more day. It had no markings, no security detail, no tinted windows, just two passengers. The driver, a young lieutenant barely out of his 20s, clutched the steering wheel with both hands, flinching slightly each time the truck jolted over a pothole. Sweat soaked the back of his uniform. He was trying to drive carefully, but the road offered no such grace. Next to him sat a man who looked plain. White shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up, boots caked in dust. No badges, no entourage. Yet everything about him, his stillness, his gaze, the way he studied every corner they passed, said he was used to command. He didn't need medals to be recognized. That man was Ibrahim Traoré. Mention his name in a political room and voices would lower. Mention it in the field and soldiers would stand straighter. He had led men into fire, had walked through the bones of broken towns, had returned alive when others didn't. But today, there was no camera following him, no press waiting. Today wasn't about power, it was about presence, about returning to the soil that once raised him, to feel whether it had changed or if he had. The truck turned a sharp corner near the remnants of an old market. Half the stalls had collapsed. The rest stood like abandoned skeletons. The driver hesitated. He glanced toward a cluster of people at the end of the block, not threatening, just watching. "Sir, this area is not exactly safe. We could take another road," the young man offered, voice low, uncertain. Ibrahim didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window and breathed in the thick air. Then, almost without emotion, he smiled. Not out of amusement, but out of knowing. "I trust the people more than I trust bulletproof glass," he said. The driver said nothing more. Orders were orders. The truck rolled forward into a street that looked like time had passed it by and never looked back. They drove slower now. The road was scattered with puddles from old rains, each one holding a sky that hadn't changed. The further they went, the more the silence pressed in. It wasn't fear. It was something heavier, like the city itself was holding its breath. Ibrahim looked out, eyes scanning every detail. The faded paint on walls, the dents in metal roofs, the posture of people who had learned not to expect kindness. Then, just as they turned into a particularly narrow lane, he saw her. At first, she was just part of the background, another shape among the garbage and broken concrete. She sat beneath the rusted awning of a long-abandoned shop. Legs pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped around her knees like she was trying to keep her body from falling apart. Her skin was scorched by years in the sun. Her dress wasn't a dress anymore, just a handful of rags held together by habit. Her face was hidden beneath a curtain of tangled hair, unmoving. A plastic bowl with a broken rim sat nearby. Next to it, a dirty cloth rolled into a makeshift pillow. She made no sound. She didn't look up. She didn't beg. She didn't even seem to breathe. But something in her posture, the curve of her shoulders, the angle of her neck, the way she folded into herself, struck Ibrahim like a whisper from the past. It wasn't recognition yet. It was memory stirring, a feeling, unformed but undeniable. He stared for a moment, then said barely above a whisper, "Stop the car." The driver looked confused but obeyed. The truck halted with a soft jerk. Ibrahim opened the door and stepped out. The heat wrapped around him instantly, thick and punishing. He walked forward, each step slower than the last, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him was bracing for pain. She still didn't move. She didn't know who he was. Or maybe she didn't care. But when he was just a few feet away, she turned her head. What he saw wasn't just a face. It was a collapse of years. A face that had once smiled, that had once leaned over his bed and hummed lullabies to calm him through storms. A face that had vanished 17 years ago without a trace. Now it was cracked and dry, weathered, hollow. But the shape of it, the bones, the mouth, the scar beneath the left eye, it was all there, buried beneath suffering, but unmistakable. She looked at him. Her eyes were dull, but not empty. Somewhere inside, a spark flickered. She blinked slowly, like it hurt to do even that. Then her lips moved, chapped and colorless. A sound escaped, small, fragile, like a breeze through a crack in the wall. "Toto." That was all she said. That name, a name only one person ever used for him. The name of childhood, of a time when he was just a boy with dreams, not a soldier with scars. It broke him, right there in the middle of a dirty alley, in the heart of a forgotten city, surrounded by waste and heat and silence. Ibrahim Traoré, the commander, the leader, the symbol of strength, cried. No warning, no resistance. Tears rolled down his face and dropped silently to the dust. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because standing in front of him wasn't just a homeless woman. It was his sister, Zahara, the one who had once shielded him from their father's anger, the one who used to hum lullabies made up on the spot, the one who disappeared when life got too hard, and whom no one ever searched for. She had lived nameless for 17 years, without papers, without a home, without anyone even remembering she existed. She had never died, but she hadn't really lived either. Now, after all this time, she had returned to him not in triumph or reunion, but in ruin. And all she brought with her was that name, a name whispered like a ghost, and a story no one had ever heard. And in that moment, Ibrahim realized he could command armies. He could lead revolutions. He could change the course of a nation. But he had failed to protect the one person who once meant everything. Nothing would ever feel the same again. Ibrahim stood frozen. In front of him wasn't just a nameless woman begging on the street. It was a piece of his buried past, suddenly risen from the ruins of reality. Her face, though worn down by time and hardship, still carried the unmistakable gaze of someone who had once lifted him up every time he fell. Zahara, his sister, was now curled up on the pavement of the very city they once dreamed of escaping. One of his hands clenched tightly, trying to stop the tears rising to his eyes. The other trembled slightly, reaching forward as if to touch her, but afraid that if he did, she would disappear like a mirage. In that silent moment, memory came rushing back uncontrollably. Their childhood in the countryside, where they lived with Aunt Miriam in a thatched-roof mud house in the north. At night, when the Harmattan winds blew, dry and sharp, carrying dust from the desert, they crept through the bamboo walls, chilling their skin. As a boy, Ibrahim would curl up under a thin blanket, lips trembling, eyes damp with fear. Zahara, barely 10 years old then, was always the one who shielded him. She tied cloth around his knees after scrapes, fanned away mosquitoes with her bare hands during humid nights, and most of all sang him to sleep with a soft voice. No real lyrics, just quiet melodies, half lullaby, half prayer, begging the winds not to rattle the woven walls. He remembered the feeling of safety that voice gave him, as if, no matter how wild the storm outside, as long as she was near, the world still held a trace of gentleness. But time passed, and life pulled them apart without warning. After Aunt Miriam died from a severe malaria fever, Zahara, just 17, packed a few clothes and said she was going to the capital to find work. She hugged Ibrahim, then already a teenage boy, and smiled to reassure him. "I'll write to you. I'll come back," she promised. He had nodded, trusting her completely. But the letter never came. No word, no sign. Over the years, the name Zahara was spoken less and less at home. Not because they didn't remember, but because remembering hurt too much. Later, as a soldier, then a commander, Ibrahim quietly assumed she had died, maybe from an accident, illness, or something else he'd never have the right to know. But the truth was crueler than death. Zahara hadn't died. She had lived, a life erased. At one point, she had worked as a nanny for a wealthy family in the suburbs. They praised her for being good with children, tidy, quiet when needed. But one day a necklace went missing, and suspicion, without evidence, landed on her arm. Zahara swore she didn't take it, begged them to check again, but they didn't care. They fired her on the spot. Worse, they refused to return her ID and documents she had submitted for the job. Just like that, she ceased to exist. No papers, no rights. She couldn't apply for BOM, rent a place to live, or file a report. She became invisible. She tried to survive, washing dishes in small street stalls, babysitting for single mothers in the market. But youth faded, strength drained, opportunities vanished. No one asked who she was. No one remembered she had ever been anything. No one wondered why she sat there every day with a broken plastic bowl and that distant stare. And she stopped explaining, because there was no one left to listen. Zahara hadn't disappeared in a crash. She wasn't kidnapped. She hadn't died. She had simply been forgotten. A name dropped from registration, a face blurred from the memories of neighbors. A woman who once sang in the night now sat still as ash. No screams, no search parties, no grieving. She had been erased like a smudged line in an old notebook. And now, as her little brother, once her whole world, stood in front of her after 17 years, she didn't ask why. She didn't ask where he had been. She said just one word: Toto. As if, through all that was lost, the only thing left was his name in her heart. The memory of a boy who once fell asleep in her arms. The fragile hope that maybe if she waited long enough, someone would finally see her and remember. She had once been someone. And for the first time in all his years spent in politics, in war rooms, and under gunfire, Ibrahim realized there was a battle he had forgotten. The battle against invisibility. The battle to keep names, faces, and dignity from being erased by a world that no longer cared to look. That day, in front of an abandoned market, there were no speeches, no guns, no flags waving, but there was a kind of victory, or perhaps an awakening, when the most powerful man in the country knelt down beside his sister on the dusty ground and held her hand like it was a lifeline, like he was reaching back across a severed timeline to hold on to what was nearly lost forever. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew one thing. From that moment on, Zahara would never be invisible again. Zahara was admitted to the hospital at dusk. The wheels of the stretcher rolled steadily over the faded white tile floors, echoing down the dim corridor. Ibrahim walked behind her, each of his steps heavy as stone. Not because of the lingering heat outside, nor the suffocating smell of disinfectant in the hall, but because for the first time in his life, a life spent facing bullets, toppling regimes, commanding thousands of soldiers, he felt completely powerless. He couldn't begin to imagine how she had survived all these years. Her body bore quiet, harrowing signs. Her right leg bent unnaturally, as if once broken and never set. Deep calluses along her wrist, the kind left by rope or metal cuffs. Ulcers around her mouth, likely from severe vitamin deficiency. Each of these small details struck like a bell ringing in his head, again and again, with a single question. Where were you all this time? The doctors didn't recognize her. No name, no ID, no previous record. They wrote her down as female patient, unknown identity, estimated age 34 to 38. And just like that, the weight of it all crashed down on him. Zahara hadn't only lost the right to live as a citizen, she had been stripped of the right to even have a name. Ibrahim sat in the waiting room, gripping the medical report. Every line felt like a blade to the chest. Severe malnutrition, dry, flaking skin, protruding eyes due to prolonged nutritional deficiency, evidence of untreated pelvic fracture, chronic intestinal infection, extreme dehydration, possible nonverbal anxiety disorder. He read every word with blank eyes, but his hand trembled. Not like a commander before a battle, but like a man standing trial in front of his own conscience. That night, he didn't return to the presidential residence. He didn't inform his staff. He stayed alone in a borrowed room near the hospital. No chandeliers, no ringing phones, no stacks of classified documents. Just a wooden chair, a worn desk, and his old leather notebook, the one he only used for the things he could never say out loud. On the blank page, he wrote slowly, deliberately, "If my own sister, a woman who once meant my childhood, my family, my entire memory, could be forgotten for 17 years in the heart of this city, how many others are still alive and yet lost to us? How many women who once had names, brushed hair, dreams, have been swallowed by silence simply because no one ever asked how they were doing?" He put the pen down, leaned his forehead into his palm, and stared into nothing. A wave of anger rose inside him. Not at society, not at the city, not even at those who turned their backs, but at himself, because he, the man who spoke so often of justice, of belief, of national dignity, had never once asked, "Where is my sister?" But Ibrahim was not a man who stayed broken under pain. He stayed silent, and then he moved. No press conference, no cabinet meeting, no grand declaration, just one small act. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a tissue, the kind usually used to wipe sweat, and a blue ink pen. On the soft, fragile surface, he wrote in his military handwriting, the same style he'd once used to mark battle maps. Repair, not charity, justice long overdue. No one witnessed the moment. No camera, no secretary, no advisor, just a man under a weak yellow light, writing the most important words of his life with the same hand that had once pulled a trigger. From there, he began retracing every possible record. A note from an old health outpost, a nanny registration form from 17 years ago, a blood test report from a private clinic nearly a decade back. Every scrap of paper was like a shattered bone, needing to be pieced together to rebuild the outline of a life, the life of a woman who once existed, once cared, once protected, and was then forgotten. But Ibrahim knew Zahara wasn't the only one. She was simply the proof, a living, breathing testament to something far bigger, that a society can run without ever seeing its most vulnerable. And that same night, as the ceiling fan hummed gently above him, he understood something with painful clarity. If he once fought for the borders and body of the nation, then now he must begin a different kind of war, a quieter, slower war, to restore names to those who have had theirs erased. And Zahara, the sister who once sang him to sleep in the dry desert nights, would be the very first name written back into the world. Zahara didn't ask why she had been saved. She didn't cry out in gratitude or bow her head in desperate thanks. On the morning she fully regained consciousness, in a hospital room at the end of a quiet hallway, where the only sounds were the distant clinks of a syringe against a metal tray, she simply looked out the window, where a few dry leaves drifted past in the breeze, and whispered to herself, "This time I won't let myself disappear." The doctors told her she needed more rest. Her body, they said, would take months to recover before she could walk properly again. But Zahara, though far from healed, began sitting up. Each morning she forced herself to walk slow, trembling laps down the hallway. Each evening she folded her sheets neatly, wiped the bed with a damp cloth, and arranged her sleeping space with care, as if rebuilding her life might begin with simply tidying up a blanket. When she was later moved to a small rehabilitation center, one quietly founded by Ibrahim, with no announcement or ceremony, Zahara didn't ask who paid for it. She didn't see herself as a guest or someone in need of care. In the small cloth bag she carried were only a few scraps of old fabric, a needle, and a spool of thread worn thin from years without a home. Within 3 days, she began mending torn shirts worn by other women at the shelter, clothes held together by safety pins, stained by time. No one had asked her to do it. She didn't speak much, but each stitch she made was steady, precise, and deliberate. It was as if she wasn't just fixing clothes, she was repairing the feeling of being seen. As more women arrived, from alleyways, shelters, clinics, trash dumps, they often came in silence, eyes cast down, shoulders curled inward. Most of them didn't offer their real names. Some were survivors of violence. Some suffered from depression. Some had simply run out of reasons to go on. Zahara didn't ask them to open up. She did just one thing. Placed in front of them a needle, a spool of thread, a square of fabric, and asked gently, "Would you like to try stitching a line?" No one quite knew why they said yes. Maybe it was her calm voice. Maybe it was the way her eyes held no judgment. Or maybe, in the quiet rhythm of her movements, there was something unmistakably familiar. Not a helper, not a counselor, but something closer, an older sister. And so on the first morning, 2 women stitched, then 3, then 6. One afternoon, a young local journalist came to take photos for a small piece on the city's new program for homeless women. As she walked past the courtyard behind the center, she spotted Zahara sitting under a neem tree, holding the hands of a young woman whose eyes were swollen from crying. The girl fumbled with the thread, her fingers shaking. Zahara didn't teach with words. She just placed her own hands over hers, guided the needle, stitch by stitch, gently, as if repairing more than cloth. The journalist snapped a photo at that moment, unposed, unfiltered. Just morning light falling across 2 bent heads, one hand cradling another, and a tenderness so soft it seemed to quiet the whole world. That photo ran on the front page the next day with the headline, "A woman stitching dignity, back together with thread and patience." Within 48 hours, the story spread, not because it was dramatic, but because it reminded people of something they thought had been lost: quiet kindness. Hundreds of letters arrived at the paper. People wanted to donate fabric, thread, or volunteer at the center. But Zahara didn't accept them all. She said, "I don't need charity. I need people willing to sit down, stay quiet, and truly listen." And something remarkable began to happen. They came, not with money, but with their time, their presence, and the stories they had never told. Zahara never stood at a podium. She never gave a speech, never chanted slogans, never appeared on television. But every morning before the sun rose too high, she boiled a pot of tea with dried baobab leaves and ginger, wiped clean the plastic chairs in the courtyard, and laid squares of fabric out on an old wooden table. As the other women joined her, one by one, she greeted each with a small nod, then sat and stitched. Every tear, whether in cloth, in bags, or in hearts, needed patience and respect. And Zahara, through her quiet presence alone, taught that to everyone who came. She didn't need applause. She didn't preach. She didn't ask anyone to change. She just lived the way she mended fabric. Without rushing, without judging, always leaving a little extra thread, as if to say there's still room here, still space for one more person to be sewn gently back into the fabric of life. The house had no tall gates, no grand signage, no security guards, or sleek glass doors. Hidden down a small alley lined with trees whispering in the wind, the home Ibrahim had quietly built, an extension of the first recovery center, was nothing more than a modest space with a dirt courtyard, a row of low concrete buildings, and a few old plastic chairs scattered beneath a neem tree. The only thing that was always there, rain or shine, was the kettle of tea Zahara brewed every morning and the wooden benches she set beneath the shade. No one needed to knock. They just walked in, one by one, as if stepping across an invisible threshold between the world outside and a place where names didn't need to be spoken to be heard. Women began to arrive from everywhere. Some walked 10 kilometers. Others were brought by local health workers. A few had only heard rumors from a friend who once had tea with Zahara. They didn't come to be saved. They came to be seen. No one asked their names. No one made them fill out forms. All that mattered was that they came. And when they did, there would be a seat waiting, a warm cup of tea, and a pair of eyes that greeted them without suspicion. Many of them had never been asked, "What do you want?" Zahara never posed that question aloud, but in the way she poured tea slowly, in the gentle nod she gave when someone sat down, she was saying everything. "I know you're tired. You don't have to explain." From once trembling hands came quiet creations, not art pieces, just handkerchiefs, patched shirts, small pillows. But in every stitch was a universe. One woman embroidered a window slightly open. Another traced in red thread the shape of a mother holding her child in the dark. One simply sewed a small lamp. But that tiny glow cut through years of silence. No one taught them to design. No one asked them to tell their stories. But in each pattern was memory, grief, longing, things they had never spoken aloud. An elderly woman over 60, abandoned by her own children, stitched perfect circles, round and even. When someone asked what they meant, she said, "Heartbeats, the only rhythm I still have left." None of the items were for sale. They were hung on the walls, placed in shared rooms, or sometimes quietly sent to shelters as wordless gifts. No prizes were given, no one stood out. But everyone knew, only when you make something with your own hands do you truly feel alive. Zahara never asked anyone to be strong. She never told her own story in dramatic terms. But her presence, steady, humble, unwavering, answered a question that haunted so many. Who am I if no one calls me by my name anymore? Zahara didn't offer an escape. She made no promises. She simply sat beside the women who had been abandoned, beaten, called worthless, and quietly helped them stitch together the pieces of their broken lives. Some felt a hand on their shoulder for the first time that didn't hurt. Some cried silently as the needle passed through cloth for the first time. Some went weeks without saying a word. Then one morning showed up with a spool of purple thread, the color they had loved as a child. None of them were ever rescued. They rescued themselves. With a scrap of fabric, a single stitch, and a woman who sat beside them without turning away. It wasn't a miracle from above. It was a miracle of patience, and of being, for the first time in years, truly seen. That afternoon, the sun had softened. The sky turned a pale yellow, touched by the dust and haze of a city preparing to close its day. In the small backyard of the house, Zahara was watering rows of mint and basil with an old aluminum pitcher. The herbs were still tiny, fragile things she had coaxed to life from dry soil, mixed with tea leaves and wood ash bit by bit, just like she had helped the forgotten women around her rebuild their lives from cracked earth. The air was quiet. Only the sound of insects and leaves rustling in the soft wind filled the space. The scent of wet mint, damp soil, and a fading sliver of sunlight on the old stone step created a kind of stillness Zahara rarely found in her life. Then she heard footsteps, not hurried, not loud, but clear. The kind of footsteps that used to wear military boots, now walking slower, more careful, as if not to disturb anything fragile. She didn't turn around right away. She gave one last pour to the wilting mint. But when the steps stopped just behind her, she stood and turned, calmly. It was him, Ibrahim. No uniform, no escort, no government seal. Just a man in a wrinkled shirt, a coat draped over one shoulder, and in his hands, something wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, worn at the edges. They looked at each other. No rush, no forced smiles, just looking. After a moment, Zahara tilted her head toward the porch. They sat together on the familiar step, the one where she waited each morning for the sun to rise high enough to begin another day of mending other people's wounds. Ibrahim placed the cloth bundle in his lap and slowly unwrapped it. Inside was something small, old, a rag doll stuffed with scraps, with mismatched button eyes and one crooked arm sewn at the wrong angle. Zahara saw it, and in an instant, time slipped backward. She raised her hand to her mouth. Her fingers trembled. Her eyes stayed locked on the doll, as if unable to believe it had survived. "You kept it all this time?" she asked, her voice softer than the wind passing through the neem leaves. Ibrahim didn't answer with words. He only nodded. Once, then again, slow and firm, as if each nod carried a year that had gone by. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet truth no longer hidden. Zahara reached out and touched the doll. She didn't take it. She rested her hand lightly on it, as if feeling the pulse of a childhood nearly lost. Her fingers traced the crooked stitches, paused on the uneven button, and finally landed on the twisted arm. "This arm," she said with a small laugh that caught in her throat. "That's because I ripped it off and you made me fix it, didn't you?" Ibrahim smiled faintly and nodded again. The light had shifted now, casting gold across the chipped wall behind them, like a painting slowly fading into dusk. Zahara pulled the doll into her chest, gently, the way a mother might hold a child she thought she had lost, or maybe more truthfully, the way someone cradles a piece of memory that had been gone for so long and somehow came back whole, even after all the years had worn it down. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Between them was a silence that no longer felt heavy. It was full, like music without words, like an apology accepted without being said aloud. The sister sat there holding the doll close, the brother beside her, eyes watching the sun as it lowered past the rooftops. And for the first time in many years, the world seemed gentle enough to let them simply be who they were. Not heroes, not victims, just brother and sister, beginning again. We often think change has to be something big, that it must begin with laws, with public forums, with media coverage. But sometimes real change starts much more quietly, with a gaze that doesn't look away, with someone willing to sit beside another person without expecting anything, without needing answers. And if you've ever passed by someone and thought, they're no one, maybe you just walk past someone who was once someone's entire world. Look again, before it's too late. If this touched your heart, even just a little, we ask for only one thing. Don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel for more real, soul-stirring stories that remind us of the power of compassion, dignity, and silent courage. And if you believe the world needs more leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, leave a comment below with just one word: hope. Let's flood the world with it. Disclaimer: this video is a transformative, creative retelling inspired by real humanitarian values and public leadership. It is intended for educational and emotional engagement under the principles of fair use. We do not claim official affiliation with any government figure or entity. All visual audio materials used are edited and repurposed for commentary, inspiration, and social reflection.